Hello, art appreciators. Welcome to Chapter 3 Study Guide, Themes of Art. So before we begin, full disclosure, I feel like this chapter it kind of drops the ball. Some of the information that's presented in this chapter is part of the core of really appreciating art, which is what this class is all about. And it's the different types of analysis and sort of basically the different lenses that you can apply whenever you're looking at any type of art. And I just don't feel like this chapter provides you with adequate information. So there are a lot of artworks in this little video lecture that are not in your book, but the information is really, really important for building as we move forward, especially when we get into the art history section of this class. So having said that, this little video might be a little bit longer than some of the others. And with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so last week in chapter 2, your group discussion was about aesthetics, and I asked you guys what your kind of aesthetics were. Just as a refresher, aesthetics is the branch of philosophy that basically deals with why you like or why we like what we like. So I want to pose two questions before we go forward. Do you think that art has to be beautiful to be art? And can you like a work of art that you don't find beautiful? So keep those two questions in mind. So I want to take just a moment and I want you to make a judgment. So this is Pablo Picasso's Las Minas, right, from 1957, and I want you to make an aesthetic judgment. Do you like this painting? Would you hang it in your house? Does it fit with your other aesthetic values? Would you own it? Would you pay money for it? Do you want it, right? Do you like it? So, and I want you just to form that judgment and just just remember that and keep that in your mind as we move forward. Moving on. All right. So, like I said, the first slide, this chapter deals with themes of art, which are basically the ways in which you can look at art, the lenses that can be applied. And one thing to keep in note, maybe as a test question, is a work of art may be looked at or reflected upon by more than one theme. So let's go ahead and begin. All right. What I refer to, this book refers to these as themes. I refer to them as types of analysis. That's the way I was taught. And this idea makes a lot more sense to me than themes. Themes is, I don't want to like get into a whole discussion about semantics or anything like that. But I think that types of analysis and the ways in which this is broken down is much more understandable than this general kind of concept of themes. So basically, any artwork communicates ideas to you visually, and interpreting those is a cultural skill that has to be learned. There's no one that just naturally understands art, right? It's very much so a skill set. So this is a list of the different types of analysis. You could put the word analysis after each of these words. And the order of them doesn't really matter except for these two. So formal analysis goes at the top and contextual analysis goes at the bottom, right? And that will make sense as we go forward. So if you're taking notes or writing these down, just remember that those ones in the middle, their order doesn't matter. Only the one at the top and the bottom do their kind of order of operations matter. So let's break down formal analysis first. So formal analysis is using the principles and elements of design to understand any composition, right? Chapters 4 and 5 are going to be about the principles and elements of design. So just kind of introducing that as a term right now. These are all the principles and elements listed out. And one thing I want you to note, this is very important, is that this is the most restrictive way to look at a work of art. So let's do that now. This is Edward Hopper's Nighthawks. And if we were going to use formal analysis to break this down, all that we would be able to talk about is the use of line, the use of shape, right? The use of color, of value, of contrast between this sort of bright interior and then the kind of gray exterior, right? Maybe the value of color as far as warmth and cold, right? What we do not get to talk about is where we think this takes place, who those people are, maybe the time frame that it appears that they exist in, right? Formal analysis is very restrictive. It is only looking at those principles and elements of design. It is only looking at the artwork's composition, right? Nothing about the artist's life gets to come into the discussion, nothing about the I don't know, social political situation of the time, right? None of that comes into play. So that's formal analysis in a nutshell. All right, the next type of analysis is religious analysis. And your book uses this term, the sacred realm, as the theme for this. So the sacred realm is kind of like it's like an all-encompassing term that basically means anything that cannot be seen by the human eye, right? So this helps give concrete form or visual form to abstract ideas, which is why it's very, very important. And again, last chapter, we introduced the term iconography, right? That was one of your key terms for that time. And we looked at that image of Buddha, and he had the elongated earlobes and sort of that little bun on top of his head, and there was those hand gestures that went along with it. And those were all part of the Buddha's iconographical identity. That was how we knew who that character was. All right. So this brings us to a new term that is kind of building off of that, and this is iconoclasm. So icons is basically the Greek word for images. So an iconography is like understanding, mapping the images, and then iconoclasm is the breaking of images. And this happens many times throughout history within religion. One religion will break the images of old, or sometimes even within a religion there will be kind of this shift of ideas and previous images will be broken. So anytime there is the breaking of images for a religious reason, that is called an iconoclasm. But the big thing I want you to take away from this is the sacred realm is I don't want to say it's like a PC term or like a politically correct term, but it isn't a very all-encompassing term, because sometimes something can be sacred and important, but not necessarily religious. So that's one of the reasons why this term comes into play. So let's break an artwork down by religious analysis or the sacred realm. All right, so this is Madonna enthroned. Last time we looked at an image of Madonna when we learned about iconography, and one of the things that we said was she's always in blue. Mary is always in blue, and we see that here because blue is part of her iconographical identity. That's how we know who Jesus's mother Mary is versus Mary Magdalene or versus some other character, maybe some donor or something like that. Another thing I want to point out about kind of the placement of individuals in this is if we look at this through sacred analysis, we kind of see there's this architectural division here, right? And there's people below that space and then people above. And this is the representation of the sacred realm and the real realm. All those people below that little kind of archway, that little architectural space, those are real people that exist in our realm. It's basically the donors who paid for the painting and possibly important, like the bishop of the church, those kind of important figures, right? And then everyone above that is existing in the sacred realm. So again, that sacred realm is giving physical form to these sort of abstract ideas of religious individuals, right? They're part of the sacred realm. Okay, moving on. Next, we're going to talk about stylistic analysis. This is one that your book does not mention at all. And this is grouping artworks by their similarities, basically. And it can be within an individual's body of work. So if there's an artist who has made several paintings in a specific style, and then their style changes and everything that comes after that looks different, right? You could kind of break their career or their bodies of work down into multiple stylistic changes, or it can be within an entire group or culture, right? We all think of ancient Egyptian art. You can point out ancient Egyptian art from a mile away. You know that style, right? It's very iconic. You see it, you recognize it, and you know it. So that's a good example of that. So let's break down or just see some stylistic works. These images are not in your book, but they are all part of the Impressionist period, and they're all by different artists from the late 1800s. And there was a shift at this time in history. Photography was becoming a lot more apparent, and photography has realism to it. So artists weren't as constrained or weren't pressured as much to create ultra realistic images. There could be a lot more exploration of style, of paintbrush strokes, and all those sorts of things. And that's part of what the Impressionist movement was about. So we group all these artworks together, not just because they were all from the similar time, but because all the artists are working in a similar stylistic way. So you guys got that. All right. The next thing that we're going to talk about is social political analysis. Your book breaks this down into the politics and the social order, but it's basically art that is intertwined with society in some way. So let's look at one of the artworks from your book for this. So figure 3.6 is the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius. And in your book, there is kind of it's the same statue, but it's with like a gray background. And it really doesn't provide the full context. So that's why I'm showing you guys this image. So if you look at Marcus Aurelius' image in your book, you see him, or you see the statue kind of face to face, eye to eye. But that's not how it's contextually presented, right? So anytime a person is up on a horse, they're higher than you, right? They physically have this elevation over top of you. This person is presented on top of a horse, on top of a pedestal, out in the street. And he has his hand kind of out over top of all the people beneath him, right? He's the ruler, he's the emperor. So that is part of the social political statement that he's making by his placement. And the image that you see in the book doesn't really convey that the same way that this image does. This image really lets you see just how far you can never look the emperor in the eye in this statue, right? It's so far up there. You're never going to see him kind of face to face, eye to eye, right? He's this unattainable figure that's up there while you're down here. Right? That's part of the social political order. That's part of what Rome was trying to convey when they created this statue, the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius, while he was emperor. So you can kind of see it's not that this artwork is in any way kind of angry or dominating or anything like that, but it is definitely conveying the social political order of who is on top and who is beneath that person. So, all right. Next is historical analysis. Your book talks about this as stories and histories. So oftentimes what is going on in the world affects a lot of the art that's being made. And this can be something as simple as the availability of materials, right? If an area is in some kind of natural disaster or something like that, there might be no artwork being made at that time, or very little artwork. There might be sort of the lack of precious materials, those kinds of things. So let's break down an artwork by historical analysis. So this is in your book. This is Pablo Picasso's Guernica from 1937. And this artwork can really not be separated from its historical analysis. So let me give you a little bit of just a little kind of history lesson. So in the late or mid 1930s, Spain was in the midst of a civil war, and Hitler was sort of rising into power. This is before World War II like officially bursts out onto the scene, but it's it's kind of the boiling point of that happening. So Hitler develops this new bomb, and he wants to test this bomb out. So one of the Civil War factions in Spain wants to make sure that they have an alliance with the Nazis, with Germany. And they say, hey, you have that new bomb you want to test. Why don't you test it on this town called Guernica? And not only do they allow Hitler to do this, but they actually send out people who are essentially data collection people. And they record how many buildings are in this town, the distance between the river and the closest, buildings, every doghouse, outhouse, chicken house, how many people, how many horses, how many animals are all in this town. So that way, when Hitler bombs it, or after Hitler bombs the town, he knows exactly how destructive his bomb was because he had all that information presented to him ahead of time. So this is a major historical event that deals with the bombing of a civilian population. This was not a military complex or anything of that nature. This was a civilian population of people. And Pablo Picasso, who is Spanish, was outraged by this and actually left Spain not too long after this happened, and never returned to live there. So he made this painting called Guernica, which is very, very, very large, right? And that's part of the size and scale of the painting, along with all of the imagery that you see, is conveying his feelings about that historical event. So just to look at this painting without knowing about the town of Guernica would be kind of, you wouldn't understand the painting fully. You could never fully appreciate the sort of like fear and the angst that you get when looking at it until you know that story. So that is a good example of historical analysis. Next, we're going to talk about feminist analysis, and this is kind of a subsection of social political art, or kind of like a subsection of can be a subsection of any of the types of analysis. So it basically considers the role of women in artwork as subjects, creators, patrons, and viewers. And that can mean that it is about a specific artist's life and their biography and the things that happen in their life, or about a specific, if a woman was the one who purchased a lot of artwork or commissioned a lot of artwork. It's technically a subsection, but it's a very versatile way to look at artwork, especially if it deals with women. So on that note, we're going to talk about the Grand Odalisque. All right. So this artwork caused quite a stir in France when it was first created. So there's quite a few things that we see here that aren't quite right about this painting. So one of them is the actual body of the woman. This woman's spine and her back is too long. It's basically has extra vertebra and extra ribs in it, right? So her body is elongated in this unnatural way, and she's laying in this unnatural way. She's turning back and looking at the viewer. She's also a very European woman, but she seems to be in this harem setting. Right, so in France during this time, there was kind of this fascination with the Middle East, and specifically with the idea of the harem, right? Where there would be these, what a harem is in reality is a bunch of women who sort of live in one house together and kind of raise all of their children as a group. And some, it might be that some of them are married to the same man and have children by the same men. And it also might be that they're, 3 or 4 brothers kind of built a big house and put all their wives together to raise all their children together, or something of that nature. It's not a ultra erotic thing in the way that the people of France in that time perceived it. And that's what we see here. We see this very wrong interpretation of another culture, right? This merging of there's all of these kind of things about the painting that are just kind of incorrect, right? Not only her body, but also sort of this eroticness of it. And there's all these like kind of fabrics around her, which all would have been brought from the Middle East. All right, so we're looking and thinking and talking about this painting in a feminist analysis. So we're going to move on to talking about art and art. So this is one of the themes that's explained in your book, and basically what this theme is about art that looks to other art for its inspiration. It's not, the book uses this term being pursued for its own sake, which I think is slightly misleading. It's art that is referencing other art in history, right? Think of it as like sampling in music, right? Sometimes there will be a little melody in the chorus or something that is referencing an older song, right? And that's an acceptable thing to do, right? To reference those kinds of things. So this is a great example from your book, right? Of taking the Grand Odalisque, which is what, let's get a different color here, what this body of this woman is, and putting this kind of gorilla mask on her. So what the Gorilla Girls did in 1989 was they took out a bunch of billboards all around the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So basically, if you were on your way to the Met driving a car, you could not get to the Metropolitan Museum of Art without seeing one of these billboards. And it's, do women have to be naked to get into the Met? So it's referencing the Grand Odalisque, which was the painting that we just saw, in order where things weren't quite right, right? And making a social political statement for the time, the 1980s, you know what I mean? It's not art for art's sake. It's referencing back to art that was created before to make new statements, new ideas, new percolations of things. And all of this is kind of under the guise of feminist analysis. So let's move on. Next, we're talking about looking outward. So this theme is from your book, and it deals with the everyday, the here and now, and how from looking at images from a specific time, we get a good understanding of what their everyday lives were like. So think about things like clothing and fashion, right? If we didn't have paintings and whatnot of people back from the 1330s, we wouldn't know what did people wear, right? What was the fashionable styles? How did they do things? So there's a lot of information that's presented from that. So we're going to see an example from your book, right? So this is the picture that's in your book is a slightly different image than this. Again, I always try to add images from different angles or whatnot to give you a little bit more context. So this is a model that was created during the ancient Egyptian, was built for the tomb of one of the emperors. And the idea behind this was they believed that the afterlife, which is the sacred realm, right, is very similar to this realm. Right? So that's why this image is, we know that people would have driven cattle in this way. Counting the livestock was something that the emperor would do. He would come out and he would parade all the livestock that he technically owned in front of him or around them, and they would kind of take count of that. And they believed that this similar thing would happen in the afterlife, because the afterlife was kind of like similar to this realm. The sacred realm was similar to this realm, but was eternal. So that is part of looking at the here and now. Archaeologists use art a lot to understand the lives, everyday lives of people from all different times in history. In contrast to that, your book has this idea of looking inward. So that's looking outward, and this is looking inward. And this theme addresses the question of who am I? I want you to think about this in the term of, rather than looking inward, in the idea of identity, right? An identity as a type of analysis. And this is asking the question, who am I? But asking that question in a self-constructed way, and who you are defined by society, right? Your gender, your age, class, biographical circumstances, all those things are both self-constructed and defined by society. And those two things together are what creates your identity, and artist's identity, and the people that they're painting's identity. So that's identity. Closely related to identity is biographical analysis. And this considers an artist's personal experiences and how making work will align with their biography, with the times in their life. So I used the example earlier when we talked about stylistic analysis of maybe an artist had this way that they worked for a very long time, and then there might be some sort of biographical circumstance that would have changed their life in a multitude of different ways, and their work would change as a result of that. So again, some of these types of analysis are going to overlap a lot, right? We could use that same idea of one artist's identity shifting as a way that their work would shift. So let's look at the example from your book. 318 in your textbook, figure 318, is Frida Kahlo. And Frida Kahlo made many, many, many self-portraits dealing with her biography and how she felt. So the one in your book is different than these two, but I just wanted to put them in there to give you more context, so you would understand just how many that these paintings about Frida Kahlo's biography are certainly not standalone. There are many, many of them. She had paintings about her relationship with her husband, and paintings about her kind of dual identity. Her father was German and her mother was Mexican, and she grew up in Mexico. But yet there was this dual identity, this sort of European version of Frida, and then this indigenous Mexican version of Frida. So there's kind of dealing with her identity and her biography and all of the things that happened in her life. Frida Kahlo has a very interesting life and made very interesting art about her life. So moving on. Next is what your book refers to as the theme of invention and fantasy. And this is art that apparently springs from the imagination and is often tied to fantasy and daydreaming And I want you guys to kind of shift away from that tone or that idea that the book is putting forward. And think about this from psychological analysis, or the lens of psychological analysis. What state of mind was the artist in when they were creating the work of art? And what, if any, psychological response are they trying to get out of you as the viewer? So this is the example from your book. This is Henry Rousseau's The Dream, right? And you can kind of see how this artwork has is kind of this invented fantasy landscape, right? It's not a real image or a real depiction of anything that happened in real life. And that's the example that your book gives, but I'm going to give you guys a different example to kind of work with and think about. So this is Vincent van Gogh's Night Cafe, right? So this is not in your book. I think it comes out of in your book at a much later chapter, but we're going to talk about it now in the context of psychological analysis. So I want you to make a judgment real quick of, do you want to go here and spend time? Do you want to be in this place? So whenever I have a classroom and I'm talking to you guys in person, someone always without fail is like, there's a pool table there. Of course I want to go there. But is there anybody playing pool? Does it look like any of the other people in the room want to play pool with you? Do they look happy to be there? Right? So in this image, it's kind of like you just walked in the front door. There are chairs and sort of disarray of seating. There doesn't really look like a place for you to easily just sit down to spend time, to get something to eat or whatever you may be there for, right? No one's playing pool. No one seems to be having a good time. These people look like they're falling over. There's this gentleman here in this white coat, which is indicates that he's the bartender, that he's the owner or whatnot of this establishment, but he doesn't really seem like too happy. He's kind of got his hands in his pockets. He doesn't look like, he's not like welcoming you like, hey, you know, it doesn't look like an incredibly welcoming place. And then on top of that, there's these strange colors, right? There's this deep red and then this kind of, the green of that pool table doesn't look very fresh green. If you've ever seen like a pool table with a nice green felt on it or whatever, that looks very old and worn. The floor looks yellow, but it's almost like a sickly yellow color. And then we have that green of the ceiling. It doesn't look very welcoming, and that's intentional. So Vincent van Gogh created this painting to communicate to you that establishments like this, these cafes, which are basically bars, are places where people go to destroy themselves. They're not places where people go to have a good time. And color is very important in communicating that. So if you, hopefully not, but if you've ever been someone who has maybe had a little too much to drink, and then you threw up, it might have been these colors, this kind of yellow bile and that sickly green and maybe even a little bit of blood in there, right? As that red on the wall. And that is part of how Vincent van Gogh is getting this psychological response out of you. And I know every time in class, there's always someone who's like, but there's a pool table. I so want to go there. But even with the fact that there's a pool table, it's not a good place to be. You always want to be comfortable wherever you are and safe wherever you are. I wouldn't necessarily feel super safe in this location. So that is psychological analysis. That is Vincent van Gogh trying to get a psychological response out of you as the viewer. All right. The next theme that your book puts forward is the natural world, and this theme deals with our as people relationship to nature, both as a subject matter and as a material or as a source. So this is the example from your book. This is a slightly different image than the one in your book, but just gives you kind of a little bit more context. This is the spiral jetty. This is in Salt Lake in Utah, right? So it was kind of this mounded up spiral jetty that came out. You could walk out on it. And then for a while it got flooded over, and then when the waters kind of receded, it was still there. So this is using the earth as a material and as a canvas, and a little bit about our sort of relationship to the earth and what we can achieve, what we can put on it. So it's all about the natural world and our relationship with it, right? Because the natural world did kind of take back over the spiral jetty for a while when there was a flood. And then when it receded, there was still that evidence of it there. All right. So next, if you remember, we had that long kind of list of all the different types of analysis, and there was formal analysis at the top. And the last but not least is the all-encompassing contextual analysis that goes at the bottom. And this is understanding and using all of the types of analysis that we've used before to fully understand a work of art. So both artists and viewer play a role in providing content to this and providing meaning to contextual analysis. So let's break down a couple more works of art here real quick. So this is Diego de Silva's Las Minas, right? So we're going to do contextual analysis for this. So we're going to talk about all of these other types of analysis as quickly as possible. Okay, so first we have formal analysis. So if we were to use that, what we would talk about is things like the value, right? There's this kind of dark background and there's this bright foreground. There's lots of squares, right? It's a very kind of lots of right angles, especially in the background, a little bit in the foreground. And there's only sort of organic shapes in the foreground, right? There's sort of this middle light source that's kind of attracting our light right there at the very center. Right? All the people seem to be right up in our foreground, all those kinds of things, right? We don't get to, for a formal analysis, we don't get to talk about who those people are. Okay, so next is stylistic and religious analysis, or the sacred realm. We could compare and contrast it to other artworks from the same time frame, but we're not going to do that for this purpose. We're just going to kind of move on from those two to historical, social, political, and identity. Those are the three big ones for this artwork. So let's go first with identity and who these people are. So this here in the center is the princess, right? And then you're looking at the princess at the same time that you, as the viewer, are getting your portrait painted. This is the back side of the canvas by the artist. And we know this because there's this little mirror in the back. Let's go to the next slide. There's this mirror in the back which has this miniature portrait of the king and queen. So from that little miniature portrait, that puts you as the viewer in the seat of the king and queen. Let's go back to the image. Right? So there's a lot going on with identity and also social politics, right? Who is important? The king and queen, you're seeing something that they would see, right? This is rare. The artist has depicted himself alongside these important people of society, right? So basically what's happening in this image is the princess has burst in to talk to her parents while they're getting their portrait painted, right? But something else that's important to note is this artist. At this time in history, artists were kind of considered like blue-collar workers. They did not have massive social standing. They worked with their hands as painters, which thus made them kind of, even though it's a very important skill, the society at the time saw them as kind of like unskilled workers. So as this blue collar worker, he's placing himself right next to the princess and her ladies in waiting, and right in front of the king and queen, which is a place and a position that he actually does hold, but to depict himself alongside those people, right? That's really playing with his identity and pushing his identity and elevating it, right? Here I am right alongside all these super famous and important people, thus I am super famous and important too, right? That happens. If we saw someone famous in the store, we'd get our selfie with them, right? And that's kind of a common thing that happens. That's essentially what he's doing. He's trying to elevate his own social status by painting himself alongside the royal court, right? So that kind of covers the history, the social political ideas, the identity of the people, the formal analysis, right? So that kind of brings us to all those things add up together to make the contextual analysis of what this painting is about. Now, Diego da Silva's Las Minas, there's kind of that information that we just talked about a little bit. But this artwork was very much admired. And at age 76, Pablo Picasso decided to reinterpret this artwork, right? That art for art's sake that we kind of talked about a little bit earlier from the book. And he brought his own style and his own aesthetic, and he repainted this painting 45 times. So you know there was something that he was really searching for to make 45 copies, not copies, but 45 reinterpretations of this artwork. And this is one of them. And if we look at this, we can see there's a difference in what Pablo Picasso is interested in conveying to us as the viewer versus the original Las Minas. So if you look here, we see a lot of the things. Now that you've seen the original, you can kind of see a lot of the similarities, right? You can pick out who the princess is, right? You kind of see the mirror in the background kind of being depicted there and whatnot. But what I want to make clear is how large this character is, right? That's the artist. He takes up the entire painting from top to bottom. He's so important that he's larger than all the others. So in the original, the focal point was kind of this little girl, the little princess. But in Pablo Picasso's version, there's so much detail in this character, right, in his face, especially when you compare and contrast it to this character, who is basically a stick figure. That person is not important to Picasso. Picasso is not interested in the Spanish royalty or in elevating his own social status. He's interested in paying homage or the importance, the influence that this artist has had on him, on his life, and maybe a little bit on the history of artists in Spain. They're both Spanish artists. So that's why that character, the artist, is so large in the room and so much more important than all of these other people who were historical figures and whatnot, but they're not the ones that Pablo Picasso is interested in their legacy. So this brings us to the discussion for this week. So, did your opinion of that painting change basically from the beginning of this little video lecture all the way to the end? Did it change? After you understood the contextual analysis of Picasso's Las Minas, did your opinion change? And please tell me how, tell me why. You know, kind of give this a little, give it like a 2-paragraph kind of thing. Don't just be like, yep, it changed. Give me a little bit more than that, right? So there's these two together. Good luck and have a good day, guys. Here are key terms. Forgot this slide was after that. Okay, so yes, here are all the key terms. Have a good week.